and I am very excited to be here at the Culture Shifting Weekend and to be on stage with this amazing panel talking about one of my favorite topics, impact investing. Actually, anything impact related is one of my favorite topics, but moving capital towards businesses that are working on impact is certainly up there. I am joined here by Jacques-Philippe Piverget, the co-founder and managing partner at Ozone Ventures, Nasir Qadri, venture partner at Pier 70 Ventures, Patrice Green, program officer for inclusive economies at the Surdna Foundation, and Joe Scantlebury, vice president for program strategy at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So I am going to start out with a couple just quick get-to-know-you polls of my panel, since I know you all have access to full bios. So first, can you raise your hand if you make for-profit investments as part of your work? Great. Cheers for that, yes. Raise your hand if you also make nonprofit grants. Great. So legal structure agnostic over there, I see you. And if you expect a return on your for-profit investments, raise your hands. Impact investing and expecting a return on investment. I like it. Okay, so quick get-to-know-yous for context. Can everyone just run down the list and share your assets under management and the approximate amount of money you move or investments that you make each year, just so we get a sense of what we're talking about here?
Sure. Thank you again for having us. On our end, we're a relatively new fund. Collectively, we've invested in over 100 companies and moved more than $1 billion. More recently, our fund that we're building right now has a $50 million target. And we've run a beta over the last 3 years, which included $100,000 in 27 different companies, just to test our process, which we believe to be somewhat differentiated from the norm. And I'm sure I'll get a chance to get into that a bit more later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thrilled to be here. For us at Pier 70, we are also a fairly new fund, headquartered out of Seattle, Washington. I'm based in Washington, D.C. Target size, 250. It was founded by two Boeing executives. And within Boeing, they have experience in investing, particularly in general in venture capital firms. So they deployed $250 million, return a little south of $4 billion. For me, I've spent, in the spirit of social impact investing, I spent the past 8 years finding and developing and investing in early stage education technology companies, 24 investments, 6 deals lead and 3 exits to date, and been very intentional as a unifying theme, investing in women, people of color, and entrepreneurs who come from outside of your traditional tech hotbed.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. The Surdna Foundation is a 100-year-old family foundation based here in New York. We're a national foundation with a $1 billion endowment and a $100 million carve-out for impact investing, with about an 80-20 split between mission-related and program-related investment. And we're about 60% sort of out in the market on that. And we do about $50 million in grant making each year. And our program, the Inclusive Economies team, I'll shout out my colleague, Michaela Davis, who is also here. We do about $9.3 million in grant making annually.
Thank you.
Before I give you numbers, just a little bit about the Kellogg Foundation. We're a foundation dedicated to children. And we believe children thrive in families that are secure and in communities that are equitable. We have an $8.3 billion trust that actually gives us the privilege, I think, of making $420 million a year in grant making approximately. And of that, $100 million is dedicated to mission-driven investments, and about $50 million is dedicated to what we would call loans, program-related investments.
Down the line again, what is your investment thesis in one sentence?
Let's see. Pier 70 Ventures is a inclusive venture capital fund that's focused on finding, providing catalytic capital, and scaling early and growth stage businesses where our partners have domain expertise. So education technology, fintech, and real estate tech are our core sectors.
Thank you.
So for Serta, we look at our impact investing as another tool in our toolbox. And we're really looking at how do we leverage impact investing to support our overall mission to foster just and sustainable communities. And then particularly, how do we move capital through fund managers of color who are supporting entrepreneurs of color that are solving the problems of today for the communities most impacted?
Thanks.
I would simply say, you said one sentence, right?
Yeah, there's been a lot of commas on the stage so far, but that's all right.
Semicolons are your friends.
Semicolons, yeah.
I'll simply say that for us, racial equity is central. Racial equity is central to everything we do. And I would also add to that second part is that returns. When we think about mission-driven investments in particular, we do expect returns. But we do expect those returns and the people who manage those investments to actually have a very critical and clear eye on racial equity.
Thank you.
I'll continue the trend of the semicolon. So with the impact investments, we keep it very broad, supporting entrepreneurs who have products or services that we think will benefit society in some form or fashion. We think we have 3 key differentiating factors. One is geography. We're focused on Latin America, 80%, 20% globally opportunistic. Second, team. Our team is comprised of people who have built significant businesses that many people would recognize. Lime, the scooter ride-sharing company, Skype, Airbnb, GymPass, a solar company that grew pretty fast. So we like to think that we're able to help companies grow much quicker than they otherwise would. And then third is with respect to process. We're using collective human intelligence and AI to be smarter about how we diligence opportunities, how we source them, and ultimately we believe it's going to lead to not only better outcomes for our fund, but we hope that 5 to 10 years from now, it's going to lead to a swing with respect to how these things are done. It also leads to decreased bias and other benefits.
Thanks. Okay, so now you all have heard a little bit baseline about folks on the stage. We are going to do Q&A. And so I'm priming you now because I've heard that everyone rushes at the very end, and I want to make sure that we have some questions up front. So start thinking about your questions while I keep asking some more, and we'll switch it to the audience in a few minutes. So return on investment. With dollars, that's easy to measure. How do you all think about ROI when it comes to impact? And what does that balance look like as you think about that in relation to the ROI that you're getting financially?
Yeah, I think I'll kick things off here. I think about it in a couple buckets, and I'm sure it's probably similarities across how we think about it. One, companies that are disrupting the status quo, that are tearing down institutional barriers. For us, it's deploying capital in the Black and brown communities. You think about equity and outcomes as well. So, but disrupting the status quo, tearing down institutional barriers, and adding capital into Black and brown communities. So for us, it is a unifying thing that we're looking at diverse management teams. So as we won't, even if it's, we're gung-ho on that the team has to be diverse. And so that's a social impact component to our thesis.
Yeah, so what I would say for us is, one, because our impact investing is tied very closely to both our mission and then to our programmatic strategies, that we sort of look back to what are those things. So on the mission-related investment side, we're looking at things that overall we're looking at how do we have a just and sustainable community. So how folks are taking climate change into effect. But in that portfolio, we're also looking at those to be sort of risk-adjusted rewards, right? As with our program-related investment, we're still looking to make returns, but our expectation is there's uncompensated risk. We're looking to use that capital to really be testing and proving out innovations in the market, innovations in the way capital flows. And not only that, I think very similar to what Joe said in terms of, CERNA has had a social justice sort of air to its work over the course of its 100 years, but in the last 10 to 12 years has really hunkered down on social justice. In the last year has centered racial equity. And so part of what that means for us is that we want to be intentional about how are we able to use our capital to effectively uncouple what risk and race being connected, and how are we doing that by supporting fund managers of color and looking at for how we are demonstrating in the market that there are communities of color, there are entrepreneurs of color that are doing great things in their community and they are making money.
So I'm going to riff off of Patrice. Thank you for doing that. So I, in my work as a vice president overseeing all of our place-based work, which spreads across New Mexico, Mississippi, Louisiana, Michigan, Haiti, Mexico, some stuff in Brazil, and I'm told my CEO is getting on a plane on Sunday, so we may be back in South Africa next week. When I think about all these places that we're working in, our board chose these places because of the deep long-term inequities in this place. So when I meet folks who are thinking about impact investing, it was kind of one of those words that everybody discovered. And all of a sudden, you'd meet people in any setting, anywhere, they hear that Kellogg does impact investing and would want to have a conversation. And great. I'm on LinkedIn, have a conversation, it's all good. But I ultimately want to ask the question when folks come to me telling me about return on investment, what difference are you making in the work that you're doing? What difference do you intend? So even in the places that we do PRIs or places in which we do a mission-driven investment, we're asking the question, okay, it's a health-related investment. Are mothers better off? Are children better off? How are you capturing that? If we're doing something that's related to employment, so in the city of Battle Creek, one of those flyover places, right? We're asking the question, can we invest in a small city and regenerate its economy? Not can we simply make grants and do some good work and see some small businesses come about, but let's use Detroit. We invested in the Entrepreneur of Color Fund. The result of it has been many, many, many more small businesses and entrepreneurs showing up and getting access to capital so they can join in to the miracle that is Detroit's rise, on and on. So we're asking ourselves, so who's coming? Who's benefiting? How are they benefiting? Those are the questions that ultimately I'm listening for when I'm meeting folks who are pitching me or my colleagues for a loan and investment, or, hey, I'm a fund manager of color. We say, that's great, wonderful. We invest in all fund managers of color. That's who runs our portfolio. We want great return, but what are you about? And how does that show up?
To continue building on that, I think we're into pretty much all the impact areas that have been mentioned, so gender as well as race equity, pretty much all the UN SDGs, and typically if you take a step back as a venture fund.
UN Sustainable Development Goals.
UN Sustainable Development Goals, exactly, I figure everybody knows it, but I shouldn't be so presumptuous. Typically, we would look to make it slimmer, right? We'd pick a couple, and that wouldn't necessarily represent all that we care about. So what we decided to do instead is change the process. So create a platform that we can use leveraging all our resources. So in our case, for example, as part of our beta and the 27 investments I mentioned, we have a universe of over 2,500 functional and sector experts that we lean on for helping us make those investments. I'm describing it as a transition from the me model to the we model. Right? I think I'm great at lots of things, but I know for a fact that there's no one thing that there aren't 50 other people who are better than me at that one thing. And so we leverage that. We have a platform that we've developed. And the idea for us is we can now bring significantly more resources to all the issues that we care about and that we know everyone else cares about, and to do it in a meaningful way, right? We talk about these trillions of dollars that are in the investment universe. A very small portion of that thinks of impact in the way that we think they should be. So in as far as we can de-risk what it means to invest in early stage companies. So those 27 companies, one stat I'll provide, because I could go on forever and I don't want to take all the oxygen in the room, But the typical angel investor, about 10% of their investments have an up round in 12 to 18 months, raise more capital. Typical top quartile venture investor that does early stage investing, 20% up round in 12 to 18 months. Our cohort of 27 companies, 80% up round in 12 to 18 months, 40% women, 50% minority, without having a filter on women and minority. So what that says is the collective human intelligence is actually really smart and far less biased. If it were just me, maybe it'd be all, black men from Haiti who went to my schools, right? And so we're looking to move away from the ego model of I'm an expert, I know better, to a collective model, which we think is going to drive change across lots of sectors.
So you're talking about this idea of the folks that you invest in going on and raising more capital. So I'm curious, who funds those folks the next time around? And is that a way, or are there other ways that folks on the panel that you work with more traditional investors, or that more traditional investors could get involved with the type of impact investing you do?
So I can take this. For us, I raised my hand for market-based returns and expected returns, and not the grants, although I think grants are amazing. So an example of a company that we invested in recently is a smart engine company that makes engines for electric vehicles. These motors are half the size of the traditional electric engine, right, that's produced, but put out more than 3 times the power. It hits on at least 4 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but it's a massive market. Who invests next is whoever's lucky enough to get in, right? The truth is that company probably didn't need our money, but we're connected, we know people, it worked out. But the next investors are people who are going to be into the UN SDGs, who are also just interested because whether it's a scooter, a car, a plane, HVAC, anything that has a motor will benefit from this. And so that's kind of how we think of the next set of investors.
Sorry. I want to go back to when we think, just to go to take your question a different direction. I think very often what we listen for and try to observe is investors and ideas that are really bold enough to think about racial equity in a very specific, clear way. If we're talking about something as mundane as housing, are we talking about investors who are willing to talk about the history of restrictive covenants and the legacy that they've created, and then to think through what is the investment portfolio necessary to drive equitable housing? Something bread and butter, but also something that's really critical to families. I think about investors like we've invested in a group called Propeller in New Orleans, thinking about food chain, but also, anybody been to New Orleans? A lot of food there, right? Right? Who owns that food chain? Who's part of that food chain? Very often, it's not the people who live there. So we ask our partners to actually think about how people in communities can own what we all come to enjoy, right? How do we make that happen? And how do we give you the kind of capital that actually builds that sustainable ownership? We think that's key to the kind of diversity that our economy needs. We think it's key for the kind of economic inclusion and economic justice that if we don't have, our country's going to continue to decline, in terms of its prosperity and its ability to generate prosperity. The demographics of our country is not destiny unless we change this, okay?
The one thing I'll add is the traditional investors just checking their blind spots, right? And so them being proactive, right? So 80%-ish of fund managers are white. And so, expanding their social network, more of them should be in this room to get to know us. We should get to know, we don't know each other, right? And so the more proactive traditional investors are, hopefully that yields additional investments. And then there's obviously there's a number of research out there that talks about when you invest in diverse management teams, it actually does yield higher profits than teams that look the same, that come from the same schools. And so we continue to see this pattern recognition across the VC, across a number of funding vehicles, but the more proactive, and I think that's the next wave of culture shift, is like how do we get more white folk in this room along with maintaining our theme. My hope is that we move the needle as we see more inclusive investment entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add, I think we are beginning to have more conversation about who are the next sort of follow-on investors to the folks that we are investing in, and how do we as a foundation sort of use our position to get into spaces where folks may not otherwise, and to prime the pump so that folks are ready to, I think, to Nasir's point, to help folks see that there are folks that are not in their room, and to do some warm handoffs for folks and doing that work. But I think it's right that, one, folks need to be thinking about, like, to Joe's point, like, what kind of impact are you looking to have? What do you want to do, and what do you want to get out of it? And how are you beginning to ask those questions, and not just sort of investing in the way that you've always done? Because let's be real, traditional investing has an impact. The question is that impact positive or negative, and do we take that into account versus the return? Right? And so it's one of those things that, we're talking about impact as though it's this little thing, but it's not. None of those things are impact agnostic. It's just a matter of we haven't actually factored that in to what the cost is.
And let me also lift up Patrice and her colleagues. The other thing that they do, and many of us try to do, is we remind philanthropy that this is risk capital. If it's not, we don't want to lose. We want to win. But we're used to investing in things that have no return. So take a risk. We can be riskier. And once we've taken on the risk, we're literally saying to other investors who are happy to come to our tables, and we join their tables, like the folks that we work with at Living Cities on through, continue to invest in this success that's now, we've removed some of that risk, right, through our initial investments.
Come on in, the water's nice.
Can I add one more thing? Just made me think of this. So we're all seeing this uptick in private foundations and family offices becoming more interested in impact investing. There has to be, that the private sector has to become more intentional. I was gracious enough to work at AT&T leading their social investment fund, and they really leaned into having a large footprint in the impact investing space, particularly in the reimagining education through technology. And fortunate enough to invest in all across the country, but at the same time I was encouraging their peers from Target to Home Depot and even Verizon, who has actually been proactive in housing accelerator programs, et cetera. So the private sector, there has to be more of an intentional direct, providing capital in our communities, particularly as it relates to impact investing across all types of social sectors.
Thank you. So we're going to go to Q&A, and while we're finding our first question, I just want to highlight two things that I just heard. One is this notion that all of you are impact investors, like it or not. The question is just, is your impact positive, negative, or neutral? So that's a good thing to go home and think about. And then two is this idea that if you can keep tabs on the impact investors, they're actually de-risking the most high impact from a societal standpoint investments in a way that will allow you as a quote-unquote non-quote-unquote impact investor to go ahead and do follow-on funding and get the return that you need while having the positive impact. So 2 points that I just want to make sure everyone is hearing. Okay, first question. I see 2 hands, so maybe let's do 1 and 2.
Well, thank you. I really didn't want to ask questions today, but I am actually an emerging manager, so 2 years in, so I am that. We run a fund in North Carolina called Resilient Ventures, and so we have a straight-up racial equity thesis. So we actually have 3 years experience. Mine is a question and an encouragement. One is that I am a guy that teaches white people about racism, and I teach white Christians and white venture capitalists in my circle, in my network, about racism. I teach them straight up racial equity right out of Kellogg. So that's my curriculum. So just to make sure to check myself, what are the main things you think, as you would say, do we need to teach white people about this question? Make sure I'm on the right page here.
That's a wide open question.
Jump in?
Unpack that, Joe.
Can I?
Everybody wants to answer this question.
Can I say something really quick?
And I think lots of folks could weigh in on that. I will focus on a couple of things specifically. We published an item called the Business Case for Racial Equity. I recommend that to everybody to read, not just white people, but everybody should read that. We're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table all across this country and beyond this country by not being able to see the value in human capital all around us and the value of human beings. The simple truth is this: a person of color who's involved with investment, the fact that they're a person of color is not a risk. That's not the risk. But everybody in this room who's been in this work for a minute, you know that when your face shows up, it's automatically a risk. It's seen as a risk. It's treated as a risk. And guess what? We even risk each other. What's that brother trying to sell me? He from Haiti? What they doing in Haiti? What they doing in Haiti? Well, I'll tell you what we're doing in Haiti. We're partnered with SUNY to build a sustainable village in Akaye, right? Because the people there have self-organized, even with all the horrible stories you hear about Haiti and this, that, and the other thing that's not working in Haiti. What we know in Haiti is that the people work. The people get stuff done. And so therefore we're investing in the people in the community who've organized, and we brought SUNY in as a partner to come in on the ground to bring intelligence and capital and intellect to many of the conversations that are happening. A state university system that's willing to take on the risk. I don't have anything special for white people that everybody else shouldn't have.
A couple of things I would add there. I think Darren earlier today hit on a few things, especially around making sure that you're using the knowledge and wisdom that's already in that community, because there's something to be said about making sure that it's culturally sensitive and that you're doing the right thing in that regard. I've also seen it in philanthropic circles. So I've worn many hats. After the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, I helped organize an event not far from here that had about 1,000 people, the governor, celebrities, everything else. And in that regard, even when we were deciding what to do with the capital, I think we made the common mistake of providing to the typical big organizations. But in retrospect, we should have gone with the smaller organizations that are based on the ground because they actually know what the issues are. The other example I'll give is that I was a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. The former president there is Les Gelb, and we did these policy seminars. And so it would be U.S., Afghanistan policy, U.S., Latin America, et cetera. And for us as business executives, we'd be asked, what is the right thing to do? And we'd provide the answer. And Les would always say, look, this is U.S., blah, blah, blah policy, and we care about our interests. And so as a person of color, I think you have a role to play, absolutely. But I think the leadership, and you have to have people on your team that reflect that community, because no matter how hard you try or what you try to do to be helpful, also read Dead Aid by Mbiso Oyo. It hasn't been done before. My grandfather worked for the UN in the 60s in the Congo. Right? The UN, anywhere that it's been, is still broken. Lots of money has been poured in. And I liken that to kind of, a white male working on gender equity alone. Doesn't mean you don't have a role to play. It means that you have to have support of the people who really understand the fine points of the issues you're trying to deal with.
I want to add just one. Brian Stevenson talks a lot about proximity, like being proximate, being proactively proximate. So next year, you and your cohort of white friend investors, you all should be here, right? And so the more proximate you are in building those authentic relationships, the more I think you'll be able to customize and really get a sense of what's happening in our communities, black and brown communities.
Seconded.
I think the only thing that I would add, before this life, I worked in federal government for one of those places that's very much responsible for all of the housing issues that you talked about. And one of the things that I was there that I would tell folks is that if we do business the way we've always done business, it's innately discriminatory. And so if you are not in the business of sort of questioning the system, in terms of how it works for you and who it works for, then there's likely someone else who it is not serving, and it is actually probably harming. And so not just white people, but particularly white people, because most of the systems in this country have been built to be in service to white people, is that if you aren't questioning how is this serving me, and then who may not be being served by it, then you're likely going to sort of miss those systems. And it could be particularly in how you're investing or what your systems are to move through that, but it could be even in how you define risk, how you define impact, all of those things about questioning when I show up, and if this is my automatic response, then you should probably question that response.
Thank you. That was such a great question. We have 38 seconds left. So I am going to go to our lightning round questions. And you'll have to keep the conversation going out in the hallway because this is amazing. Okay, is everyone ready? These are literally like 1 to 2 words each. Okay. They don't know what these questions are. Number 1, straight down the line, first concert you ever went to.
Michael Jackson, a long time ago.
Incognito, Tabernacle, Atlanta. That was like 1992, 3.
Immature.
Fania All-Stars, Madison Square Garden.
Okay, number 2, one thing you always take on an airplane.
I take my Beats, large headphones.
A book. I'm always reading.
My phone.
Lip balm.
Last question. One food you would eat all day, every day if it was healthy for you.
I'm from the Caribbean. Rice and beans.
Spaghetti. I'm all about the carbs.
Nachos.
Bacon.
Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So, Mila Calhoun, Michael Penn, Health Equity Ventures, Alabama Power Foundation. Okay. Hey, you probably need that.
It's campus series. Yeah, we need to put this. It's gonna turn. We need to switch computers. So let's put a general on for now.
Pronunciation of your last name.
We can do it a black or some black or to Salesforce.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Candace Cook-Simmons and Aaron Betru for Opportunity Zones.
Hello. So before we start, I just want to ask, and the panel that preceded us was amazingly funny and charming and great, and we are not promising that. But what we will promise you is that we'll be honest and we'll bring to light some issues that I think are critically important. So Aaron and I are thrilled to be here. What we will not be discussing are the nuanced intricacies of actually formulating your opportunity zones. We will go over some bigger picture issues that we think you should be discussing. Why are we not going through the nuance of it? Well, one, it's all been printed out. It's been done to the point of almost exhaustion, and if you want screenshots of the most recent version of Practical Law, there 8 pages of the codes, what can happen, what you should think through, almost a mini white paper of what makes sense as you formulate that. So we're not going to spend time with Aaron on that because we've got a bigger picture to discuss. What we're also not going to do is pretend like this conversation is going to be shielded or directed specifically to this audience because it's an audience consisting of majority brown and black faces. To be honest, I would have this exact same conversation regardless of what the consistency and the constituency of this audience is, and so would Aaron. And that's what we want to focus on. We're going to get into the meat of it, but before we start and sort of lay a groundwork of what opportunity zones are and how they best work, I think it's also critically important for us to remember that opportunity zones holistically and inherently have a very small audience. They are about redirecting that allocation of capital, and it's a capital gains protection. Inherent in that reality means that the people who may most be affected by that policy are not in this room. We hope that they will one day be in this room, but we are talking about communities that are going to have the decision-making of the people here making decisions about how their communities are created. And what we hope, almost more than anything else, is that you recognize that that community building is a stewardship, a financial stewardship, that is not a luxury that we can dismissively allocate, but it's a responsibility that we don't have to necessarily want, but that we have to, most importantly, own. So transitioning into Aaron and his work, Aaron, I really want you just to, for those who haven't seen the bio, give a groundwork on the work that you do with Opportunity Zones.
Sure. Thank you for the invitation to be here. So I am the managing director for the Milken Institute Center for Financial Markets. For those of you that are not familiar, the Milken Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank that focuses on how do we use financial markets, products, services to build meaningful lives. And in that includes a whole gamut of different things, but something specific to this body of work actually stemmed from the previous administration. The Obama administration called a meeting in 2016 trying to get at this point around wealth inequality. Many of you have seen those statistics that if you look at minority households in comparison to non-minority households, for the last 30 years, we've been having a massive decline of wealth in African American households. I think it looks like it's going to take, if those figures turn, it would take something like 200 years to catch up to non-minority households. On the African American side, on the Hispanic side, it would take something like 80 years to catch up. This wealth inequality, to address it, the previous administration called a meeting all about how to change wealth creation, which quickly devolved to a conversation about small businesses, and within small businesses, minority-owned small businesses that are critical for creating jobs in minority neighborhoods, where I participated with a number of other stakeholders, Kellogg, the previous speakers within the room, Rockefeller, a bunch of black and brown banks, and the net issue was access to capital for minority-owned businesses. That is a huge gap, all the conversations we're having today. And from there, we created a partnership with the Small Business Administration. I was the co-chair. This is when the former administrator was there, Maria Contreras-Sweet. And we looked at different cities, Baltimore, LA in particular, and trying to say, well, how can we provide capital? This group is really critical for creating jobs. 99% of enterprises in the US are actually small businesses, largely because we have 42 definitions of small. But at the end of the day, growing them requires capital. And there is a huge disparity in terms of how they secure capital. Number one source of startup capital for a small business is friends and family. And we know what happened post-2008, where wealth destruction happened in minority communities. The number two source of startup capital is usually bank credit. But when you look at minority communities, that number two source is actually a credit card, not really a sufficient way to grow a business. So we started to say, let's go after this in a meaningful way. So I stood up a task force that looked at how to grow the capacity of black and brown banks on one side, while simultaneously looking at, well, outside of access to credit, how do we grow access to equity? And therein comes opportunity zones.
And I don't want to assume that everyone has been paying attention to what's been happening with opportunity zones. We want to do almost a speed round to how we got to where we are in this conversation. So all of this happened, and there's not one administration solely responsible. We recognize that in 2017, that's when you saw the change in the tax code. And since people are from different areas, your trickle down may have come in a variety of different ways, but really what you saw was an act of 2017, sometimes parlayed into what was coined as a Jobs Act, et cetera. And you had a 185-page document, and 6 pages of that document consisted of what we now know as, or are coining as, opportunity zones. And if you had the great joy of reading, and Aaron already knows my position on this brilliantly crafted, and I am being facetious, statute on opportunity zones, which again, those who live primarily in the communities that are going to be addressed, not all, right? But it was taken from a census, or from the census. And that was how, in connection and conjunction with state and city partners, the opportunity zones were drafted. It was a collaborative effort that essentially resulted in a map. That map was the one footnote, and you can check it, it's fascinating. The one footnote that sort of illustrated the map, and to better understand the complexity of what that looked like for all people, I went to look because, and Aaron knows, I want to just go through the layout of, I don't do tax law. When a tax code comes out and an associate at your firm comes to a managing partner and says, we need to get involved with opportunity zones, and they bring you a 4-page statute that looks like an intern drafted it, you start saying, I don't think so. Where are the rules? Now, traditionally in business, our attitude is ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Like, it's here, let's go. But when you're playing with tax, that is not the type of advice any prudent advisor is going to provide. So to better understand what this meant for communities, I said, and I'm from Atlanta originally, well, let me see what it looks like in Georgia, and looked at the map and saw it almost looked like this play-by-play of demographics of communities of color, to the point where I was like, well, this is fascinating. Who were the stakeholders involved here? What that gets us to today is the elephant, so we can get into the business of actually utilizing what is a smart business mechanism, but has to be a smart business mechanism that takes into consideration the people who are not going to be able to utilize it. So I want to get into definitions. By definition, what money can be used, but prior to that, I want to just talk about the people who aren't here, and this will be my last time sort of bringing them up, because I want them to hang in the atmosphere, because what we do belies what happens to them. It happens when entire neighborhoods are elevated, but grandma's house still looks the same. So then your house is paid for, but taxes increase, right? That means that we also, as we talk about opportunity zones, for those who may not want to invest in that, working towards policy to make sure the tax codes in your respective city and states reflect protection, so we're not saying no taxes, but maybe, and we really just want to cultivate thinking here. No one wants to create a standard click-in, paint-by-numbers policy, but what we do want to create is when you go back to where you live, you have these conversations to say, what banks are involved? Aaron brought up in New Jersey, a bank just closed, a black bank. So when we say who's benefiting, we want to say, how are we commercializing this so that communities of color, and not just communities of color, marginalized communities. When we start looking at things like food stamps, et cetera, being taken away, we can look and see that it's not just communities of color that benefit from those policies. It's actually all individuals underneath the poverty line, which goes into the next part of our conversation. When the census was utilized, the census reflected 31 million individuals within what now qualifies as opportunity zones, and a third of those individuals qualify as poor, which means it's double our national average. So those are things to consider when we're talking about sort of building this up. Those are all the negatives. We just want to lay those out there because it's an elephant in the room, and it may have been an elephant that was precluding you from getting actively involved. And the goal is not to scare. The goal is to inform so that we can then structure the conversation in terms of how we can use this, but use it in a very smart stewardship manner to build.
May I just correct you?
Yeah, please.
The process, it's worthwhile in understanding. So the instruction that was given in the legislation specifically empowered the chief executive of each of the different states to identify 25% of their existing low-income census tracts. That process was an interesting one because when we got involved, I was starting to have conversations with different governors, and there were a lot of governors that didn't realize that they had a role to play in selecting, and there was a fixed time frame. So we actually called a meeting of the Black Congressional Caucus and saying, if you want your communities to be identified, reached out to the Asian as well as the Hispanic American, said then you need to coordinate a response to your state executive to say, hey, our community, this is the rationale. There were plenty that did not know 1 week before the deadline that they had to be a part of that process. But they started to reach out, and there was a lot of rushing. At the end of the day, 8,700 zones. Within those zones, 69% are severely distressed communities. There are 35 million individuals, but there are certain rules that said 5% of your census tracts that you nominate can be adjacent. But that rule, a lot of people have started to look at that and say, oh, that means they're not low income. But there was a salary cap to that. I mean, an income cap to that. It needed to be about 125% of the low-income census tract that it's adjacent to. So even though these things are out there, these zones are there, they're fully baked, they're certified for the next 10 years. The states picked them, Treasury ratified it, and were announced. They're there.
From that, I'm not going to assume everyone's a fund manager, but the way one orchestrates an opportunity zone is significantly different than the way one would catalyze for raising for a traditional round. Can you go through what not to do when going and moving into the opportunity zone space, including, of course, the obvious, not involving the community? So we know that you all know to involve the community. Now that they're there in formulating the fund, what does that look like?
So taking a step back, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act introduced two things. One was the authority to create the opportunity zones, and the other were the rules by which qualified opportunity funds work, the mechanism of how those investments come in. And embedded in that were a series of different things, and a couple of them, just to give you an idea, that run counter to normal fund management strategies. A, you needed to have, by a fixed amount of times when you realize a gain, drop it into a fund, a fixed amount of time to actually then make that investment, and how that investment needed to be a qualified investment. All of these rules are, in a couple of high-level words, there's a fixed time frame, and there are requirements how you spend that money. The fixed time frame, 6 months from realizing it to put it into a fund, that fund needs to be tested in terms of how much of that capital it has deployed. That test, depending upon what time of the year you go in, it's anywhere between 6 to 12 months, pretty much, that it gets tested. That means once a fund is sitting on that capital, it's got to move that money in there. Now, most of you realize the way that you spend your efficient sourcing is to raise all your capital. Now I've got my team sitting on my quote-unquote 2 and 20, and then over the next 2 to 3 years deploy that capital. This does not work under the OZ structure. Because of these time frames, effectively the most efficient way to do it is to find the opportunity, the transaction, and bring the capital to it. And that is a big reason why a lot of the funds that you see out there are much smaller structures, single asset structures, than the typical way of how to do it. So there's right now something close to about 200 qualified opportunity zone funds, and sitting on quote unquote $60 billion that they said they were going to raise. The vast majority of them are sub 100 million. There's only a few that have gone north of that, and only, the largest is Bridge Investment Group, somewhere in the $600 million range, if I remember correctly. So these are much smaller structures, which then starts to tell you, wait, I'm not going to have this massive team sitting on different different management fees to be able to do this. But therein lies kind of the opportunity for a group such as yourself to actually how to participate. And I'm sure that's where you're kind of heading into this, that effectively what the large-scale investors are looking for are quote-unquote shovel-ready transactions, things that can move rather quickly from once they realize a gain. And you're looking at a whole cadre of individuals such as yourself that are asking, well, why am I not raising this multi-billion-dollar fund for the benefit of these investors? Well, I would say think about it from the other way. They need the deals. If you're sitting on these transactions, can I actually figure out how to create the qualified opportunity zone business that can be sourced, scaled with the OZ investor? That's where a lot of people are starting to wake up and say, that's where I need to play, not be the 201st OZ fund manager that's going to try to raise $1 billion fund. There's plenty of those. The ones that are sourcing transactions for single family offices that have those gains, that's the big need.
What have you seen or identified as the primary reason individuals have been reticent to utilize what effectively is a capital gains protection, when simultaneous to that, most people complain about capital gains tax? I mean, read of the room. Who enjoys paying capital gains tax?
No hands.
No hands. 41% essentially of the money that you receive goes back. I mean, that's what capital gains. That's why Sean Parker was essentially the person who created the lobbying effort in 2013 to start talking about, this is what it looks like when I'm sitting on Facebook stock. How do we reallocate those resources, and how can we build from that? And so 2017 is a long runway to get to where we were to have this conversation. And now we're here. We can do some phenomenal things with it. In addition to
the reticent point, I think it's important one that you asked first. I think there is a misunderstanding of exactly what's in there. There are plenty of lawyers and accountants that really don't understand this to the level that they should. And a big part of that is they're still working on the interim rules, or they're still just dealing with an investor that just wants the ability to buy something hard and fixed and sit there. The rules are actually written in a very interesting way that can do a lot more. If you're talking about something that actually is a 10-year hold, think about it.
And explain the 10-year hold for the individuals.
So the benefits of this thing. If you are an individual that has a capital asset that has accumulated a gain, and you liquidate that within 6 months, put it into a fund, typically within that calendar year, you're supposed to pay the capital gains. What they're allowing you to do, as long as you follow the rules, that capital gain gets deferred to 2026. So time value of money benefit, number one. Second benefit is once you've made that investment in the qualified opportunity fund, depending upon how long you're invested in there, if it's 5 years, the taxes that you owed from that original exit, the step up in basis of about 10% reduces your capital gain by 10%. But if you stay in for 7 years, you get an additional 5, so you get a 15% reduction in your taxes. Now, this has to be by 2026. So you hear a lot of people saying, oh, if I don't play by December, I'm out. That's just a 15% step up in basis. You won't have enough time to reach it, but you still have the 10%. That's the second value. The third is probably the most important value, and that is if you've made an investment and held that asset for 10 years, when you exit, the full capital gain on that is tax-free, 100% tax-free. And so from a lot of people's perspectives, they're starting to say, okay, what is it that's a long-term investment that I can potentially make? Who are the individuals that have this level of gain that was mentioned? Yes, for the past 20 years, we've kind of gone from the 80-20 rule where 20% of the population has 80% of the wealth. We're actually going where 6 families globally own 50% of the global wealth. So we've had a massive stratification of wealth in this country. So few people have that level of gain. They like things that they can touch and feel. So we see a lot moving into real estate, but the potential can actually be really positive when you think about operating companies, which are part of the rules that a lot of people seem to kind of gloss over. I think, yes, the first wave is going to be real estate based because it's easier to do, but the rules with regards to an operating company, people are starting to wake up to it. And I'll give you a random example. So if you are making an investment, everybody knows at an exit you have to deal with depreciation recapture. So essentially factor back in that depreciation to net out what the taxes you're going to have at exit. If you have a business in an opportunity zone that's a qualified business, there's no depreciation recapture. So that's actually a really powerful kind of tax advantaged exit strategy that I think the third big wave, so the second one being operating companies, corporates are going to start looking at this in a much more meaningful way. Yes, I can get access to public equities and making an investment, but if as a corporate, if you're telling me that exit of a high capex business, I don't have to factor that in at an exit, that is an insanely powerful tool to squeeze returns in a way that folks aren't realizing. All of that is in the code, but for most people, it's just easier to just buy a building. But there's so much more in this.
Going back to the luxury real estate components, that's been the fastest and the one that's gotten the most or the greatest amount of attention. What we're now starting to see is individuals who are passionate about co-working spaces. And I'm using air quotes because now almost everybody has a co-working space, but co-working spaces have become very attractive. In terms of all of that and business job creation, we spoke previously about what this looks like in terms of community partners. And I think when we throw out things like getting community involved in a meaningful way, community partners are a critical aspect of that. We talked about banks. We talked about employees. How are you envisioning the winning scenario of opportunity zones such that communities have been able to be actively involved, and not just marginalized communities, every community who's a stakeholder where these buildings are being created? What's the winning strategy beyond just real estate luxury or smaller, really looking at everyone involved, from construction, development, et cetera? What does that look like? How is the winning scenario going to play out?
Well, I should start out by saying we're not a registered investment advisor, and so take all of this with a grain of salt.
And
talk
I am
to
not
your own
lawyer.
lawyers, talk
Yeah.
to your own accountants. That's recorded, right? So,
Yes.
in trying to get to answering your question, it's probably worthwhile in describing the process that we underwent. When I looked at all of this, I came at this from, okay, wow, this is great. Small mom and pop businesses can participate. Then when I started understanding exactly what was in this thing, this is first quarter of 2018 when it just had passed, started realizing there's going to be some disconnects. And I said, okay, let's try to really dig in and get to what this is going to look like. And so I put a team together. I called the lead tax advisors from ENY. I also brought in Kirkland Ellis, their fund formation team, and we said, let's do a deal on paper. And with my team, we sat down and actually went through the entire process on paper. And really, what was supposed to be a 2-page case study ended up being kind of a 40, 50-page PowerPoint deck of all these arrows exactly going everywhere and what was the different tax law that needed to be addressed. And our number one objective was to go back to Treasury and challenge them and say, the original intent of this was wealth inequality in low-income neighborhoods, but embedded in this is much harder to figure out how a mom and pop business can go because of these different rules. I've got a minority landowner in one of these communities. You're telling him he's got to dilute himself to 20%. Is there a way to think about this entity that actually he can lease it back and still participate in the rise of value? Native American neighborhoods are all, so Native American nations are all trusts. So by definition, you can't sell any of that. So are we going to disclose, essentially remove them from the ability to have something like $6 trillion of capital that can go into these to not participate? So we challenged them on a number of these different things. Once the regs came out, we cleaned up this document. It's been made public. So if you don't have it, I encourage you to go on our website. It's just called the Opportunity Zones Vignette. It's 2 of them. One is on real estate, but I injected a little bit of my isms. I made the real estate deal transaction a workforce housing transaction to kind of highlight the needs in that area. And then on the second one, an operating company deal. In low-income neighborhoods, we have too many problems with regards to cardiovascular disease, hypertension disease. So access to healthy food's a problem, so we made it a healthy food grocery store. Based off of all of this, we learned quite a bit of, it's not just the acquisition initially, that initial investment that's the case. So that needs to move rather quickly. You need to warehouse a deal. Even if it's real estate based, you need to think about all the pre-development costs with regards to taking down the process of zoning and everything. Where's that capital going to come? So why aren't black and brown banks part of that process? Because I know for every dollar of tier 1 equity from the returns of this transaction, that translates to about $8 of deposits in the community, 5 that are lent back out in terms of small business creation. You're absolutely right. The less of these black and brown banks we have, the more of a problem we have in low-income communities. And yes, yesterday, City First of New Jersey failed. So that's one less MDI that we have out there. That's one thing. The second thing is, once you've made this investment, how does that actually work in terms of all the value that's created out of this investment? So if you buy a building, you're supposed to improve that building. It's not supposed to just sit and warehouse it. You're supposed to improve that. Even a business itself. Well, what's the construction company? What's the entity that's laying the fiber optic cables? Who's doing the catering for all of these? is there a way to think about essentially minority-owned enterprises that are part of that supply chain that are getting a piece of this profit? So when I've got, investors that are saying, I'm thinking of doing X, Y, and Z, I'm like, as part of an impact thesis, even if you're not claiming that that's your thesis, can you include these different elements in this? Because that's how we make sure we solve the gentrification problem. For me, gentrification is not, stopping gentrification is not about lowering property values, it's making sure incomes go up faster than the property values increase. So if we can focus that as the second part of it, that becomes quite powerful. And then the third is obviously the products, services that are being targeted themselves are benefiting the community. And there's a number of those that are starting to wake up and say, okay, we can play in this.
One of the things that's always, I push back against is in most conversations, any narrative supporting pipeline problems, right? I don't think in most instances that we have an issue of pipeline. We have a tremendous issue in terms of accessibility. Can you hear me? Okay. They are words that maybe the recorder cannot, so I will also just speak a little louder and hope I'm not too loud. Well played. Get your questions together, team. It's not a pipeline issue, but I appreciate the fact that the majority of you have other day jobs that does not include sourcing deals for opportunity zones and also working directly with communities in order to properly or appropriately engage them in a way that will be meaningful so that 10 years from now when we are doing an expose about your opportunity zone, it's the win-win solution as opposed to look what happened when, right? So in terms of creating trust and dialogue with opportunity zones at scale, right? Recognizing that people are in different geographical regions, are interested, to be perfectly honest, in opportunity zones for a variety of reasons. No one is saying that your investment ethos has to be completely to uplift a community, but we certainly do want you to be aware of those issues. What are the best ways you're seeing for the funds? And I only say this because when I told someone I was speaking with Aaron has been incredibly helpful to funds, individuals that I am quite close to. What's been the winning strategy for individuals who want to make meaningful participation within communities, but this is also not their day job? So they do not have the trust built, don't necessarily have what may be coined as a pipeline to actively engage individuals, but want to make sure they are not leaving, not money on the table just in terms of their capital protections, but also money on the table in terms of what this looks like for longevity for an entire community to have the win-win narrative as opposed to just them and their fund.
I would challenge and say this is your day job. If you're not an entrepreneur or a fund manager deploying capital or some sort of philanthropic player, you're probably not in this room. So if you are in this room, it is your day job. This amount of capital that is looking to be deployed in the next few years, that is a significant amount of wealth that has been sitting on the sidelines in this country. So you are looking for capital, then it is your day job. If you're an entrepreneur actually building a business that's looking for capital, it is your day job. This rule with regards to how quickly it moves is playing right into your wheelhouse. You are already probably sitting at the intersection of like-minded individuals in terms of a recognition that Black and brown faces need to be a part of that supply chain and are in these communities. The bar to participate is actually much, much lower for you. You're probably sitting and saying, well, I'm not really sure I want to play in this game. I'm trying to build an appropriate business. Why should I be engaged? Again, your success is going to be driven by sufficient enough capital, the ability to scale in a meaningful way for whatever is the future market, and that future market is mostly reflected in this room. McKinsey came out with a study not too long ago that said the racial wealth gap has left about 6% of the US GDP on the table. I've hosted something for the Minority Business Development Agency, the 50th anniversary since Nixon founded it, and we looked at this and the number of different policymakers that said, wait a second, are you telling me if I can fix the racial wealth gap in this country, I can ignite 6% value for the US GDP on a global competitive scale? That makes it not just a racial inequality problem, this makes it a competitive America problem that we need to address. And so it is everybody's day job to address this.
Well, now that it's time for Q&A on your day jobs, does anyone have any questions that you'd like to ask? Please.
Hi, got to get close like a rapper. Michaelia with the Cerna Foundation. Hi, Aaron. So my question for you, and I just also want to thank you for your leadership on this. We've been following this work for some time, and you've been a great voice in the field for how to make this work for Black and brown communities. So my question for you is around what you've seen at the state and local level around how state and local policies can kind of incentivize the kind of opportunity zone investments and outcomes that we want to see, particularly around ownership and the transfer of ownership through these deals.
I'm going to jump into that because that's probably the most important thing. So the federal rules are pretty baked. Now the ground game starts of actually how to implement this in city and state side. The number of governors and mayors that are very worried about the negative outcomes is a good thing, because now they have to realize they have to play in garnering the right guardrails to get the local economic development out of this. They've all have a plan, but they haven't been able to figure out how to execute it. So the way that I've been approaching this, and so recently brought in the head of the Opportunity Zone Strategy of California, the former product development head of USAID's Development Credit Authority, and we've been playing this strategy of saying, let's bring in as much of these local policymakers and give them a sense of what this really is not a program, it's just a tax incentive. An investor still has to deal with all the issues with making a deal happen. So why don't you put on a piece of paper all the things you want to see? I want to see Black and brown minority enterprises as much part of the spend, or I need to have affordable housing as my real estate strategy, or I need to make sure that infrastructure dealing with wastewater surges from climate change is invested in. All right, let's put those on the list. Let's then look at, well, what is the headache of an investor going after those transactions, whether it's accelerated zoning rules, entitlement programs, a bunch of other things. Let's actually say, if you do this for me, I'm going to make your life easier by all of these strategies. So make it a fast track. I'm still of the mind that investors are a little bit lazy, and if you make it easier for them to do the things that you want them to do, they will flock to that. And so more and more mayors, county members, EDA strategists are actually stepping up and writing, A, first, my prospectus is this, B, here's how I'm going to get out of your way when you want to do the things I want to do, and then here's how even the city and the state starts the process of actually warehousing those things. So now we're bringing in municipal finance experts to actually look at P3 structures to deal with this $1 billion or $1 trillion of infrastructure we've got to do in this country. Where do OZ equity investments play into that? And let's actually start to do this. Waste to energy plays, fuel, next generation fuel depots that need to be done. A lot of these things are really interesting, and they all need an equity play. And can an OZ investor come in? City and state can actually be at the cusp of providing the framework or the rails for these OZ investors to do exactly what's necessary, and that's economic development.
Last quick question.
Hi, my name is Joel Burke-Solomon. Thank you for this conversation, super interesting. I was wondering, have you all seen that there are any controls in place to ensure that there is actually community participation? And so curious about that. And then secondly, of the 200 or so qualified opportunity zone funds.
8,700.
8,700.
Oh, zones or funds?
Funds.
Yeah, sorry, 200.
How many of them are representative of the communities that they are going into?
So your first question, because it's not a program, there is the only thing that folks have been asking for as part of the original statutes, it was to create some sort of monitoring, evaluation, tracking of information. That was left out of what was actually passed. However, just yesterday, Treasury announced that Form 8996, which actually you self-certify what your intentions are to do with that. They're starting to collect that information. So what people have been asking for in terms of Treasury taking a leadership role to actually collect information, they just came out with a draft document of that yesterday. So we'll see what comes out of that. There isn't a lot of information. I know there's at least about a half a dozen senators that have stepped up and asked for a fix-it bill that includes a lot more of tracking of information. We'll see if Washington, D.C. works well. But the second piece of these 200, how many of them reflect the communities themselves? This is 200 that are registered on Novogradix's website. Do I believe there are only 200 funds that are out there? No, I believe there are thousands, because I don't need to tell anyone that I'm taking advantage of this strategy. So you've got a family office that has sold one building. I had a condo in DC. I just happened to have sold it. I bought something in Anacostia. It's a qualified opportunity investment. I'm not registering it anywhere. It's just smart for me to participate in this. Now, who knows really how many of these are out there? What portion are representative of low-income residents that are in the community? Let's be honest. I'm not 100% sure how many low-income residents are sitting on a whole bunch of capital gains, because that's a requirement of this. So I think the way we have to bring the low-income residents to be a part of this is, hey, you don't have to sell when that big money comes in. You can think about leasing it to them so you participate in the long run, or think about the business that you are a part of, how to get some of the gain in this, or to think about selling into this. So I just want folks to realize being the fund manager in an OZ structure is not the only way for the community to play. There's a lot more.
I think that was the last question we were actually able to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.